All right, everyone. The red light is on, which means we're recording. This is a Mark and Kyle back for another episode of the Weekly SITREP. So, what we do is we get together every week and we talk about the business and political news from the last week, all in an effort to help you if you're thinking about getting out of the military to understand what various business terms and strategies and everything are, so you can use that going into an interview, applying to schools, or just generally feeling more comfortable about heading into the wild of the civilian world and knowing, something like a SPAC is, right, which we're going to talk about today. Okay, so the way we always start off every episode is with the mission brief. And so what this is, we talk about some like military related news, just knowing that as vets, we're still kind of interested in the national defense community and everything that's going on, right? So pretty big event that happened this week in that the Biden administration dropped some bombs on Syria, right? And I think a lot of people kind of came in with the idea that somehow, you know, I don't know, with a Democratic president coming in, that everything was going to be all, peaceful, and everything was going to be wonderful, and olive branches everywhere for everyone, right? And then we dropped some bombs on some Iranians as they're crossing the border into Syria. I mean, I got no issues with that. I don't think most people will have any issues with that at all. The article we're looking at today is kind of talking about the mixed message that this is sending to Iran. So on one hand, we have the dropping of bombs, on some Iranian-backed militia fighters crossing the border, and on the other hand, the administration is trying to court Iran on the effort to like get back into the much debated nuclear agreement, which the Trump administration pulled out of pretty quickly. So, Kyle, in reading this story and kind of knowing what's going on this past week, what are your immediate thoughts on it?
It's funny to watch on social media. People be like, "Oh, you thought you were getting $2,000 stimulus checks, instead you're getting bombs dropped on people."
Yeah.
I hate to see stuff like that, because to me, I think it really. Joe Biden never said he was not going to be dropping bombs on people. And really, as the president, right, as the commander in chief and the unitary executive, has a responsibility to defend American interests. So I am not that upset about this. And I think it's we periodically, the U.S. will target strikes in this part of the world, and people will they almost always want to compare it to something like Iraq or something, or and
right.
it's never, it's not really the same thing. What's interesting, right, is when you've been out of the military for a few years now, it's interesting to view national defense news with just kind of a different eye than I think maybe somebody who's in the military, right?
Right.
And there is a need to do this sort of stuff, right? You never I don't want to kill anybody, I don't want to hurt anybody. But there is a need, right, to be able to, for the U.S. to be able to send messages, right? And one of the ways they send messages are through soft and hard power. And this would definitely be a way to send a message through hard power. But what's interesting about this, right, is when Donald Trump pulled out of, or the Trump administration pulled out of the Iran deal, there was a lot of consternation and hand-wringing among a lot of people, including those, who were supporters of the nuclear agreement, and even senior military leaders who support this, say it's the best path forward and everything. And there's probably some debate on if actually the nuclear agreement signed by the Obama administration was the best path forward, right? There's the idea, right, that they're going to continue to try to bring Iran into the international order and try to say, hey, you can only use nuclear energy for this. And the Europeans wanted it, right, because for the Europeans, they sit over and Iran's very close to them, these are their neighbors, right? And there's deals with energy, we talk about Russia and everything. The Europeans are very sensitive to these sort of issues. And for us to come in and bomb some Iranian-backed proxies who are crossing into Syria is pretty much a message to Iran. I mean, really, what you're saying, really what this says is you're bombing Iran, because these are people who, when they see Iranian proxies, right, that probably means they were trained by Iran,
right,
they were financed by Iran, they're operating under some sort of command and control relationship involving Iran. And this is almost analogous to saying when Donald Trump, or in the Trump administration, when the U.S. embassy in Iraq was attacked and they responded with strikes, right? Like this is almost kind of the same thing.
Right. Right.
And so it's a very clear message, but then, then they go and they say, hey, we want to go back and do the Iranian nuclear deal, which, has a lot of flaws in it, right? And it's really mixed messaging, and you kind of wonder what they're kind of trying to tell Iran here, right? Maybe it's like the carrot and the stick approach, but like, why would Iran, feel like, hey, we can push you, right? And we can push you, and we can see where you're going to have your breaking point, or we can do like a slow boil when it comes to our nuclear program. And like, what are you going to do? Like, are you going to attack Iran? Like, you're probably not going to do that. So yeah, it's international policy is always very tough for any American president.
Yeah. I think it's also easy to look at this and read a little too much into it. They're looking at this situation and talking about how the U.S. is changing its relationship with Saudi Arabia, and like, we stopped the support to the Saudi-led coalition against the Houthis in Yemen. We're kind of changing a relationship with Saudi Arabia, who's like the Sunni hegemon against Iran and everything. At the same time, I'm like, these are some militia guys that are crossing the border who are probably going to try and launch attacks on Americans. So we bomb them.
It is in response to American attack.
So it's really easy to look at this and act like it's some type of big strategic picture, when in reality, I think it's more of just like a tactical move. Like we had a good fix on some targets, we hit them, move on to the next thing. Right.
Yeah, and it's also a way of imposing costs, right? Like, if you ever kind of subscribe to the Henry Kissinger, model of foreign relations, his idea was always, people have a lot of different opinions about Kissinger, but his model was always like, you have to impose costs, right? And make other countries understand that there's never a cost-free way to mess with the United States.
Right.
So it's also that, but it's just confusing, right? Because they're going to bomb these Iranian proxies, but then the Biden administration wants to release, money back to Iran. And if you're an Iranian leader, you're like, okay, so no Iranian proxies, but okay to pursue nuclear, development. Yeah.
Right. I've had some really fun and interesting talks. I have a former Israeli officer in my class, and he has some deep thoughts about Iran. It's always fun to talk to him about it.
Yeah, I went to Israel with my MBA program, and there were some students that led it, but the main leader was an MBA student. He had been in Israeli special forces.
Right.
And he actually kind of got into some arguments with the tour guide, who was like had a sympathetic view to the Palestinians and the Arabs, and they kind of got into it a little bit.
I believe
it. And like, it was interesting to hear it, right? Because this is that sort of like tension over in that part of the world. Oh, and the bus driver was a Palestinian.
Right? Oh, great. Even better.
So, it was just, and he was like, he loved Putin. He loved Russia. He's telling my wife all about it because she came with us.
Yeah.
And I was like, damn, this is the world, right? This is the world outside the United States, know? So
yeah.
Interesting.
Super fascinating stuff. All right, we're going to move on to the next story. Also, we touched a little bit on, in this talk we just had about Europe. And so the article we're looking at right now is about kind of like two competing dynamics going on in Europe and NATO right now. So, the Trump administration was very focused on America First policy, challenging the NATO alliance, asking the European members to do a little bit more. And the Biden administration kind of wants to rebounce that, renew alliances, show that there's bonds of friendship and alliance and everything, right? And there's an effort going on, kind of led by Emmanuel Macron, who's the president of France, to say, you know what, I think this might be a moment, by no means necessarily to like dissolve NATO or have, Europe pull away from it, but that Europe needs to take more responsibility over its own security, and that we can't rely on the United States to do that. And we have to be responsible for our own backyard, regardless of, American interests.
Yeah, I don't think European leaders are fully convinced that the wave of populism that kind of swept Donald Trump into office is fully done with in the U.S.
Right.
Right, and so like say if like Biden got elected in 24, then there's a strong possibility that they would be okay, like the U.S. is back, something like that.
Right.
But they're adopting a wait and see approach, and there has been a idea here. Hey, I'm
We got some visitors popping in.
we got some visitors.
This is my pet worm, Mommy.
That is very cool, sweetheart. Okay, can you go? She was showing me her pet worm. Yeah, my almost 6-year-old doesn't care if I'm doing a podcast or not, which is fine. So she's going back downstairs.
Right.
So they, the U.S. has dominated NATO for many years now, right? Post World War II.
Right.
NATO has almost collectively been the U.S., right, with our leadership and subsidizing of European governments.
Yeah.
And Europe is facing a problem right now because we kind of talked about this in the previous article. All this stuff that's happening in Syria, all the turmoil in the Middle East, Russia, that is very much their problem, right?
Yeah.
Like it affects energy, it affects business, it affects stability and security, refugees that come into these countries, right? If you've been to Europe, right, pre-COVID, you walk around, Paris, right? And there's Syrian refugees everywhere.
Yeah.
And I'm not saying that's a problem. I'm just saying that like it affects what's going on.
Right.
And Macron basically is saying, Europeans should have some sort of we should retake our defense priorities. We should have some sort of European collective defense that makes sense, right? Instead of relying on the United States and its troops just hanging out in Europe not doing anything besides having a great time, which from all of my friends who are stationed there, it sure looked like they were having a great time.
Totally.
But I don't know, like an all-European defense collective that is armed up and can act ahead of NATO is like, I don't know, that would require like power projection and coordination and defense budgets that are on orders far higher than what the Europeans currently have.
Right.
So
yeah,
it is interesting though, because this could be the start of it, right? There's been increased spending by countries that haven't spent a lot of money on defense, right? You see about what's going on like Norway. They're spending like a ton of money, right? Because they're afraid of Russia and everything, and nothing motivates people, right? Like fear. And I don't know, like they've underinvested because they've always felt like the United States will be there for them. But hey, maybe the times are changing. Maybe 30 years from now, you'll have something that's different. But I doubt it.
Speaking of, I just found out that I'm like a couple years too late to the show, but I started watching Occupied a few weeks ago. You've heard of this?
Mm-hmm. No, have not.
Yeah. So it's a Norwegian show on Netflix, and it's basically about Russia instituting a like white glove takeover of Norway.
Oh, really?
Yeah. All focused around a kind of like a change in Norwegian energy policy. So, Norway is a small country. They're very, very green, like climate focused and everything, but they're also a huge producer of oil and natural gas. And in the show, that dynamic changes, and then Russia uses some like kind of behind the curtain tactics to influence Norway back into doing what they want them to do. It's fascinating.
Yeah, I mean the whole Nord 2 energy pipeline. I mean, Russia is a petrol state, like through and through, right?
Yeah.
It's very tough for the Europeans, right? Like they are in a bit of a bind. It'll be interesting to see what comes out of it, because they are having actual security issues that are forcing them to make tough decisions now, instead of just assuming that the United States is going to be there forever. Which, if you were a Trump fan, that's probably something you'd be happy with, right?
Yeah.
So.
All right. Well, that wraps up the mission brief for the day. We're gonna head on to the Civvy SITREP. So this is kind of totally focused on news from the business world to help you all kind of better understand some terms and things that are going on out there in the world. kind of better understands the environment that you're stepping into if you're leaving the military and entering back in the civilian world. So we've talked on the show a number of times about SPACs. So these are special purpose, acquisition companies. And so essentially what these things do is, instead of a company, going through the normal process of starting and raising some venture capital or something, and for the eventual plan, years down the road to go to an initial public offering or an IPO, companies are kind of like bypassing that whole thing, and they're raising money in basically what's considered like a blank check raise. Okay, so they raise a bunch of money for the purpose of then investing that to like fund a company, right? It's a different model of like, a company that already has a product and everything going, taking on, the capital gained from that IPO. Now it's like, a company that doesn't really have a product or anything, taking on money to then decide what they're going to invest that into.
Yeah, there's a couple elements in play here, right? And so the example they're using here is this autonomous electric vehicle startup, or autonomous electric helicopter vehicle startup.
Yeah.
Called Archer Aviation. And it doesn't have revenue, it doesn't have any vehicles, it's only 3 years old, and when it merges with this SPAC, it'll have a valuation of $2.7 billion, right?
Which is just crazy to me.
So the way valuations work in the real world is there is usually some sort of fundamentals tied to the valuation. And those fundamentals usually consist of free cash flow.
Right.
Or if the company is pre-profit revenue or user growth, something that you can base a metric off of, right? And then apply a multiple based on a peer set to come up with, and we talked about this last podcast, come up with an approximate value for what the company is worth, right? Because if you say, hey, what is a company worth? Well, it isn't the book value of what's on the company's of the company's assets, right? You can't just like, hey, we think this building's worth this, and no, like you have to forecast stuff out in the future and cash flows out in the future. And so when you have companies that are basically saying investors, hey, we want to buy into this company, we're going to buy into it, and basically we're saying it has a valuation of 2.7 billion, is highly speculative. And these blank check companies are enabling this, and they're doing it for, there's a couple forces driving it behind it. The first is that for a very long time, a lot of your kind of average retail investor cannot get their hands in on venture capital, cannot jump into venture capital funding, right?
Right.
So when a company is going from startup, right, and kind of moving towards a mature company, it'll go through, now with venture capital, it'll go through these series of funding rounds, right? So there'll be like, these an angel investment, right, or seed investment, or angel investment, like Series A, B, C, D, E. And the idea, right, is venture capitalists are incrementally giving these companies money to give them more runway, right, to enable growth and more business models to be formed. And I think I saw like a number, like the average, average number of years it was before they did go public would be 10, right?
Right.
So from like inception to going public, 10, and along that way they develop like a business model, and they're kind of pushed along by venture capitalists, and they may even like build a market, or they disrupt something, and eventually they're going into an IPO. They say, hey, here's our revenue, here's our projections, we may even be profitable at this point. And that is like a very, and still people will throw crazy amounts of money at these companies, right? Venture capitalists will take huge bets. And the idea, right, is because when you go public, you have to release all sorts of documents quarterly saying, hey, here's our financials, and like all this stuff, right? And when you IPO, you got to put out all this pro forma financials. And SPACs are basically sidestepping that, because they allow a company to raise money that has no business model, no intellectual property, right? Just rely on the strength of the management team. And people are jumping in, right, because hey, I can't invest in a Series A or a Series B because I'm not a qualified investor. Which qualified investor, you have a certain amount of like net worth and everything.
Right.
And the rules is basically the government's trying to protect people from themselves, right? Because what they don't want is people pouring their life savings into something that's highly speculative, and like they don't want that. And there's I've had a lot of debates with a lot of people about it. Generally, I agree with that approach, right? And so you have both amateur stock traders and hedge funds piling into these, these SPACs, right? And like now, like celebrities have SPACs, right? Like you can, it's like Jay-Z could form a SPAC, and it's
Right.
like, okay, it's putting a lot of trust in Jay-Z's, business skills, right? Which, is a pretty good businessman.
Yeah.
But I mean, companies like Archer, this electric aviation startup, they're arriving on public markets before, establishing business basics such as commercially ready technology. And but the idea behind it is, right, is if you have to take time to build out, say the course over 10 years, like a business model and everything, and you have to like continually like raise money, it allows time for a market to form and competitors to form, and then the return could be less, right? Whereas you say, hey, we're just going to give you like all this money, and we have such faith in your management team and the technology, right, that we think you can pull it off. It's incredibly speculative, and it is tough, right, to be able to go and say, hey, we don't have to release like a quarterly earning if you're public and be like, yeah, we still don't have any product and we have no revenue, and we're forecasting that maybe in like 4 or 5 years we'll have revenue. I mean,
Yeah.
people like stock prices live and die if they're obviously if they're public, right? Because they publicly traded stock. They kind of live and die with these earnings reports because investors are trying to time very carefully, hey, how do we think this company is going to do, in order to say, hey, we're going to make money off this, or is there an opportunity cost or risk that we need to take into account here and go into another stock, right? So it's I it's just crazy, right?
Yeah.
Like these companies, they literally have nothing there, and
Yeah.
people are like, oh, you're worth 2.7 billion.
Yeah. So. And I think it's worth noting a little bit of the differences between, the SPAC model and like the traditional venture capital model. So like the traditional kind of venture capital model is like you have a good management team, you have some type of product market fit. So like you've created some type of product, it's doing something, you have, users, you have people interacting with it, and it might be a while before you're profitable, but like you're getting revenue. There's already some type of business actually happening. Now, like you need that infusion of cash from a venture capitalist to actually like, build out your software product or build out whatever it is to turn that company profitable. With a SPAC, I mean, it's like you have nothing. Like you're literally just like a piece of paper, essentially, with the hope that it's going to grow into something. And I think the difference from like an average investor's standpoint, right, is I can be totally uninformed and invest in a SPAC without really any knowledge of what they're trying to do or any inside playing on like how that company is trying to operate. Whereas with like venture capital, like you're pairing with a venture capitalist not just for the access to the money, but also because they're bringing something unique to your business, right? Like they have some type of unique institutional knowledge, some type of unique access to people, places, resources, whatever it is, to help your business grow. It's not just here's some cash, go do good stuff. It's meant to be a partnership. And you're not going to get that same level of like inside working together via SPAC if you're like a normal investor going into the deal.
Yeah, and I don't know, investors, it's kind of like retail trading. They just, hey, we'll throw money at anything, right? Because they're thinking they're going to have some sort of huge gain possibly. So it's it is interesting, and it's indicative of there being a lot of easy credit.
Yeah.
Right now, because people can get money easily. So
yeah,
we'll see.
Yeah, we'll probably keep talking about SPACs because they're a hot topic right now. Actually, we had a short story on them here in a bit. Before we get to that, we're going to talk about Warren Buffett. All right, famed investor, who has done extremely well with Berkshire Hathaway. And so the story we're looking at right now is talking about Berkshire doing $25 billion in stock buybacks for the Berkshire stock. Okay. Kyle, can you kind of touch briefly on like why a company does a stock buyback?
Yeah, normally a company does stock buybacks, right? When so the textbook reason why a company would do stock buybacks is to return money to shareholders. And so the idea is, hey, we're going to buy back stock, right? Usually maybe like some inflated premium, and that money is going to go back to shareholders, right? And they're supposed to do that when there's no, when there's no positive NPV uses for the stock, saying like, hey, we have a lot of cash sitting on the balance sheet. We don't think we can do anything positive with it right now, so it makes sense to return to the shareholders. And what's interesting about this is Warren Buffett, if I'm not mistaken, is not a big fan.
Yeah, he's famous for being very critical of doing stock buybacks.
And the reason he's critical for it is because because stock buybacks can boost the stock price of a company,
right?
Because you're paying a premium for it, and everything, and it's almost like artificially boosting.
Right.
It's a form of financial manipulation.
Yeah.
To boost
The kind of way to think about it is if you have like, X number of shares on the market, then it's worth this much, but you take some of those shares off and now like the value of the company has risen, at least the stock price has, but not necessarily like the intrinsic value of what the company is actually doing, but the stock price rises nonetheless.
Yeah. And so here he is, he's done a pretty large stock buyback here of $25 billion. And he, it's just interesting, right? He's not a big fan of it, but here he's doing it. And he's saying, Warren Buffett, he's all about intrinsic value, right? Which basically means we are about modeling and looking out into the future and saying, hey, based off the numbers and growth rates, and, we think this company is worth this, right? Like Warren Buffett is not a big speculative guy.
Right.
And so he's saying, hey, this larger than usual buyback is going to enhance the intrinsic value for shareholders, but still leave them ample funds for opportunities, saying, we're going to return this money here, but we still have plenty of money to buy. Because the thing about Berkshire Hathaway, right, is they like to hold a bunch of different companies, and they're like a huge like holding company. Sorry, I've got my other daughter in here now, currently with a trash can on her head. And they have a ton of portfolio companies, and they will they don't really like. They pull all the money back from them, right? And they put in good management teams, but they're not like trying to merge these companies together. They're not trying to create like some like industrial conglomerate of companies, right? They just like to hold companies and pull back the excess cash, right? And then decide to buy more companies, and so they usually, and they're all about long-term investing, and they say they just like to get good management teams, right? And they like to invest in what they know, and so being able to do all these buybacks here is just it's interesting play from Warren Buffett, especially since he's not a huge fan of it. But I don't know. We'll see. It basically says like, hey, maybe he doesn't see as many good buying, opportunities to buy stuff right now. Maybe, valuations are really high, which they are. The stock market is at an all-time high. And he's just like, hey, I'd rather return this money to you guys right now, because if I spend it, it won't be a good use of money.
Right. And I think kind of like something that got occurred to me too, for a while, I know he doesn't like stock buybacks is, you talked about Berkshire is a company that's very focused on long-term investing and like creating long-term intrinsic value. And too often companies can opt for a buyback just to get that like bump in the stock price a little bit. And he's generally against doing anything that's like focused on like the kind of short-term immediate things that don't actually build value.
Yeah. And one of the, something else, if you want to get even more kind of like in the weeds about it, is CEOs, right? Executives, often a large portion of their compensation is in stock, right?
Yeah.
And it's based off of targets, right? That's set out for them by the board. And they'll be like, oh, if you hit a stock price of this, you're going to receive an award of this, right?
Right.
And what Warren Buffett is basically says is that it creates an incentive. What you have to be able to incentivize CEOs, right?
Right.
To do stuff. I mean, it's just human nature, right?
Right.
But he says they'll use these to juice, the stock price, and maybe try, hit like some sort of compensation target. And he's not a fan of that.
Yeah. So the next story we're going to move on to here. So the other side of Berkshire Hathaway, the man who doesn't get as much press as Warren Buffett, but is nonetheless considered to be an absolute genius and icon in the investing field, is Charlie Munger. Okay, they're kind of like the duo that has turned Berkshire into the extremely valuable company that it is. And so the article we're looking at right now, Charlie Munger warns of market frenzy, frowns on gambling mentality, Bitcoin, and SPACs. So we've kind of talked about some, we've talked about Bitcoin a number of times on the show. We've talked about the GameStop GameStop and everything, and Robinhood, and we've talked about, we just talked about SPACs and everything. And in general, like what I'm taking away from this is that he's seen a lot of behavior in the market from investors that is going away from the fundamentals that he and Warren have built their company on, of intrinsic long-term value investing.
Yeah, Charlie Munger, yeah, definitely not as well known as Warren Buffett, but very important to the business, right? He is his partner in they're equals essentially,
right?
And he's also a bit of a hot take machine, which is notable for somebody who's 97 years old.
Yeah,
but good for him. I mean, I hope I'm a hot take machine at 97 years old. But he is much like Warren, right? Like you said, he is all about intrinsic value, intrinsic fundamentals, long-term investing in what you know. And so if you want to kind of dive into what he's saying, right? I posted some of this stuff on my Instagram this past week, because simply some of the stuff I see on Instagram is,
it's wild, man.
I mean, it's just really uneducated. But you talk to him, right? And he says, hey, he's talking about SPACs, right? People like, what are your thoughts on SPACs? And he says, hey, the world would be better off without them. He doesn't think they're a good investment vehicle, and that they are that people understand what they're really investing in. But something interesting that he does say is, he says, it's just that the investment banking profession will sell shit as long as shit can be sold. So when you think of an investment bank, right, you have a lot of vets who want to go into investment banking.
Right.
Investment banks are what we'd call sell side, right? So they are looking to find companies and package securities, right? Whether it's in the form of like debt or equity, and they're trying to sell that to investors, right? Usually on the buy side, and it could be hedge funds, it could be institutional investors, it could be, we talk about like an IPO and everything, which are what SPACs are doing, right? And the SPACs are being led by investment bankers, or the IPOs are being led by investment bankers, right? And the investment bankers get a cut of transaction fees. So they're incentivized to get as many of these things out the door, and so that is one of his that's kind of like one of his like dig at it, right? He's like, look, there's speculation that the incentives are misaligned. People, people are just pushing stuff just for the sake of pushing stuff because they know they can make money off of it in transaction fees, and he has a problem with that because they it's not good for the average investor. Berkshire Hathaway, supposedly somebody that's looking out for the little guy. I like what he said about Bitcoin, which he's like, hey, look, this thing it's too volatile to ever be a medium of exchange for the world, right? Which is, if you talk to people who are big on Bitcoin, they say, hey, this is going to replace gold as the reserve currency, right? Or what a reserve asset. And what was his quote here? Oscar Wilde's quotation about fox hunting to describe Bitcoin, calling it the pursuit of the ineatable by the unspeakable. And what he's saying about that is, people who don't know better are buying into something that they will never be able to use, is how I took that. And you can have your opinion on cryptocurrencies, but this guy has made a lot of money in his life, right?
He has made a lot of money, so it's hard to ignore. It's hard to ignore what he says.
You'll see a lot of stuff on social media, and people just be careful with what you invest your money in.
Right.
Right. And there was one other thing he was saying that I wanted to talk about. Yeah, Robinhood. I don't have a problem with Robinhood because I think it's better to have more investors in the market, right? You just want them to be educated about what they're doing, and to invest more in the long term rather than speculation. And what his problem with Robinhood is, he says it encourages gambling, right? Because if you get on Robinhood, it's really easy to use.
Super easy to use.
If an 11-year-old can figure out how to do an options chain, then
that's wild.
It's the gamification of investing, right?
Yeah.
And he basically says that companies should be selling stuff that's good for each other or good for society, right?
Right.
And what Robinhood is selling is gambling, basically, and they make money by selling order flow, which is a topic for another show. But he doesn't believe that's a useful enterprise, right? He thinks it's destructive. He thinks it's destructive, and he probably has a point.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I'm sure we will talk about things like Bitcoin and Robinhood more in the future. The next story we're going to move on to a little more nuanced and esoteric here a bit, but nonetheless some really fascinating stuff. So the title of the article is Yellen. So it's Janet Yellen removes obstacles to global corporate tax deal. Now it's really easy to read that and be like, what the hell is it kind of talking about? And it's pretty bland title. I'm not gonna lie to you. But I think generally kind of like what's going on here is there's some issues going on, especially with big tech companies in how they're taxed. So, um, most of the big tech firms are based in the United States, but they do a lot of business elsewhere. And governments from around the world are recognizing that like those companies are having outsized impacts on their economy, and they want to somehow figure out a tax structure that is both, um, encourages business, but also helps them get some money and protects their citizens as well.
Yeah, this is one reason why I think the whole nationalism or populism movement is kind of stupid, because the genie's already out of the bottle, right? You're never going to be able to kind of cap back in this idea that the world is not very interconnected.
Yeah.
And so when you think about corporate taxes, right? Corporate profits are taxed where value is created, not where customers are located. And this is one reason before well, I took a tax class in my MBA program, right? And it talked about the double Irish tax scheme or something. It was a more clever name applied to it. But basically, companies, even though they would be, for all parts and purposes, be doing, be headquartered in the United States, their corporate headquarters for tax purposes would be in a low-cost tax jurisdiction like Ireland or something.
Yeah.
And so the attempt was to reduce the corporate taxes they were paying.
Right.
And that was one reason behind the behind the tax reform bill that the Republicans pushed through with Trump. This is one of the first things they did.
Yeah.
So countries are upset about this, right? Because imagine you're a country and you have this huge company operating, right? Delivering all sorts of services. It could be like Uber, it could be Google, it could be Facebook, right? Delivering all sorts of services, right? And you're not getting a cut, And so the idea, right, is that Janet Yellen, who is runs the Treasury Department, wants to come up with a way to help kind of ease like some sort of like global tax regime out there. And there's like a million obstacles to this, right? But they're basically saying the U.S. is open to it. And because right now what you have is European countries have now said, hey, we're going to levy, they're all going to come up with their own taxes, right? And so, companies, I mean, I know nobody's going to weep for big tech, right? Everybody likes to beat up on them. But these companies now have to devote a substantial part of their time. I mean, not all of their time, but like more time than they would have to trying to comply with like 300 different tax regimes. And I'm sure accounting firms like PwC or Deloitte are practically salivating at the thought of this.
Oh God,
but
yeah.
That is not a good use of their money. They should be investing their money in innovation or paying their employees, or doing something other than trying to satisfy 300 different tax regimes. And it's also indicative of European countries, right? Have regulatory regimes and tax regimes that are punitive. I think would be a good way to describe them. And they inhibit growth, right? And so the attitude, I think, from a lot of people in the U.S. is, well, instead of trying to tax our companies, right, why don't you loosen your regulatory regimes and lower your taxes so you can encourage more innovation in your economy? People, you'll have all sorts of opinions on that, but generally that is the pushback against stuff like this. And so a global corporate tax would it's probably it wouldn't be just like one like tax percentage, right? It would be like some like agreement, that would have like some percentage, applied to it, of what, like it'd be a bunch of different tax regimes, but in like one unified agreement.
Right.
But now think about how complicated taxes are in the U.S., right? And how much argument we have over it. And now you're going to say you're going to scale it up to a ton of countries, right? Like I don't know. Who knows? I just
Yeah, I think the way I look at this situation, and we've talked a lot about the regulatory issues there are with tech and everything, and there's just like this continuing divide between what tech is doing and how fast they're moving, and the ability for legislators around the globe and governments to catch up to that and figure out like how they're going to rebalance their legislation and economies and everything to match with that. And it's I think typically we're going to see that the tech is going to take off way faster than regulation can catch up to it anyway.
Yeah, it'll be interesting to see, because they really are like if you know all of your citizens are using digital products, right? They're not using products created in your country, they're using products created in another country, and they're paying no tax, and the company's paying no tax. Like, how are you going to keep financing your government? Like, it's a very real problem they face.
Yeah,
so
big time. All right, we're gonna wrap that up and move on to our next story. Back to our good friend GameStop, the gift,
keeps on giving.
the gift that keeps on giving in the news. It's awesome. So what this is kind of talking about, we talked long and hard about the effects of Robinhood and the kind of inherent underlying value of GameStop as a company and everything. And the article we're looking at right now is talking about GameStop's now in a position where like they're in the news, the spotlight's on them, and they've kind of repositioned some things within their company. We've talked about bringing on one of the reasons their stock price went up. There are a bunch of reasons that it did, but one of the kind of the initial reasons was they brought on a exec from Chewy.com, so the e-commerce pet brand. And so people looked at that and were like, oh, okay, GameStop's going to try to figure out how to enter the e-commerce world, because they've long been a brick and mortar retailer. And that kind of coupled with the rise of like cloud gaming, and people aren't necessarily going and buying, buying games in hard anymore, because you can download everything digitally. And so they're faced with this inflection point of how do they take this moment and the giant rise in their stock price, and then leverage that into changing what has long been like their blockbuster model of hard fast stores into something that's more sustainable over the long run.
Yeah, I think this is really interesting to me, because I think this is like the whole GameStop thing will be taught in business schools for a long time.
Oh, for sure.
But what they do now is going to be a big. It's going to be a really interesting story, right?
Yeah.
So if you didn't see last week that their share price again like went screaming through the roof, right?
Yeah.
Nowhere near what we saw during the short squeeze, but I think at Friday shares traded around 110 a piece.
Yeah.
So it's important to note, right? Just because their share price goes up doesn't mean they're getting more money, right? It just means their shares are trading higher. They could do a follow-on equity offering, right, and then try to see who'd buy into it, and they get more capital. But GameStop has a really interesting opportunity here, because they, first off, they have a great name. GameStop is a great name, and second off, they have a lot of attention from investors now, right? But so now that their share price is kind of is trading higher, which means more people want to pay attention to the company and be invested in it. They now have to kind of sustain that, right? And the reason their share price was not trading high is because their business wasn't doing well. And so like how does GameStop, right? We got this Chewy guy on board. How do they reinvent their business model, right? Because all businesses have to constantly innovate nowadays in order to stay competitive. When I was at my MBA program, they had some executives from Ford came down, right? And they were talking about like how they were reinventing Ford. And, they had this former investment banker, right? And he was saying like, hey, we got, I used to be their banker, and now I'm like working with them on strategy and everything. And they're getting rid of, hey, we're trying to change the business around, see where opportunities are, and make disruptive moves, right, before the market disrupted us. And for GameStop, they could do the same thing, right? Like GameStop could, the whole brick and mortar thing, they could keep that, but they could really focus to like, maybe they could run like game tournaments, maybe they could go to like some sort of streaming platform, which I think they tried to do. They want tech-driven opportunities such as esports, mobile gaming, and game streaming, right? they've had a history of making investments in digital technology. They bought the streaming technology company Spawn Labs and digital game distribution platform Impulse a few years ago, right? Those are things that if you can successfully pull off and have a good, you could transform GameStop from being a brick and mortar retailer and transform it into something else, right?
Right.
And probably still maintain some of the brick and mortar business as long as it's viable.
Yeah.
And there's still there's still a demand for brick and mortar, right? You know,
For
because
sure.
the problem with digital game distribution is you are giving up rights to your games, right? So I have all these games on my Xbox, right, that I never play because I'm too busy. But you know, I can't go and sell them, right? Like I can't
Yeah.
like sell a
Yeah.
game to anybody. I used to be able to go and sell the games to people, right? And like you can't do that. And people don't like that, you know. So there's consumer trends that could work in their favor of it.
Yeah.
You know, but they were trying to do the whole digital game streaming service, you know, too early, right? They just weren't able to succeed. But they could still do it now, right? They could close down a bunch of stores. They could pay down some debt. You know, they could try some new business models that could work. I mean, just because a company is down on its luck doesn't mean that with some good strategy and innovation, it can't come back. I mean, is probably the classic story of that,
Yeah.
right? You know, it's the most valuable company in the world, and it used to be. I was like, Apple used to be a fucking joke.
Yeah. Yeah. Totally. Totally.
You know, so I don't know. It'll. I mean, besides getting ripped off by GameStop, you know, if you're trying to sell them your old Xbox or whatever, it'll be interesting to see what they come up with, right? Because you know, what does it say? They've got about 445 million in cash and cash equivalents as of October 31st. And it has the ability to sell 100 million stocks since December, though it hasn't executed a sale even with the stock price surge. So, you know, I hope they manage to do it.
I hope so too. And I mean, they're still a strong brand name, right? Like lots of people still think
strong.
of GameStop as like the place to go to get games, and it's like a hub of gaming culture too, right? I'm not a big gamer, but like every GameStop I've ever been in, you can tell that like the people who work there are gamers.
Really are into video games.
They're like really into video games, and like
Yeah.
they definitely make a point of like being a place for, you know, news about new games come out, people like find new games, test new games out, and also like get all the extra accoutrement and merchandise and everything around gaming. It's like a place to go to hang out if you're a gamer. So they definitely have that brand they can leverage into something else.
Yeah, and you know, there's just so much they could do, right? I mean, PC gaming is still very popular, right?
Yeah,
You know, like there's and that's very custom, you know, a very bespoke, because you do kind of have to know what you're doing. It's not as turnkey as just buying an Xbox and everything. So
right.
And I'm sure if you opened up their 10K, you know, and read what they'd say, hey, you know, I'm sure they'd say one of the strengths is our brand, right? Everybody knows who GameStop is. You know, any male in America, you know, who's done a little bit of gaming probably knows what GameStop
Lots of women too. Women are huge gamers. Yeah.
This is true. Yeah. And that's changed as well, right? You know, so I wouldn't count them out, but they need to do something.
Yeah. And just one last fun fact for y'all out there. Sometimes I think people think that 10Ks are like this mysterious document that's like hidden on the SIPRnet somewhere. They're not. Just look up any company and put 10K and you can find it instantly and take a look at it if you're interested.
Investor relations, just go to the website.
Yeah.
Or just Google it, right?
Yeah. Just Google it.
There's several documents, right?
Yeah.
But the two that you would be most interested in are 10Qs and 10Ks, right? And 10Qs are the quarterly report that companies come out with.
Right.
And they list all sorts of stuff, right? They'll list, you know, what's going on in their business. They'll list financials. They'll list where they see the business going. They'll list compensation for executives. And there's the 10K, which is the annual report. And there's all sorts of like, if you work in like investment banking, you will actually look at these quite a bit, because you'll have to like source, like, hey, we're sourcing this, right? It's sourced from, you know, you can use like platforms like CapIQ or FactSet, but they're important documents, and there's all sorts of like ways to like quickly like pull information. Like there's a software that'll like compare like one, you know, 10Q from another 10Q, right? And or you'll have companies like CapIQ and FactSet that aggregate this sort of information. So.
Right. But for any of you out there who are interested, it's all out there and free to find. for publicly listed companies. All right.
Yeah.
So the last story we're going to talk about. So we've talked about electric vehicles, and Kyle's awesome Tesla multiple times on the show. And what we're talking about now is some of the constraints that are there in getting broader adoption with electric vehicles. One of the huge ones being from an operational perspective and from like a consumer perspective, finding enough charging stations in order to get your vehicle charged, right?
Yeah.
I-
So, what did you want to say?
I was going to pass it over to you because I know you probably have some firsthand experience in this.
Go ahead.
Yeah. So no.
So the electric charging thing is it's almost a good analogy, right? Is with different phones and computers, right? There's like a bunch of different chargers, right? And so there is an opportunity here, and the opportunity, and I've seen it actually, I can't think of them right now, but there's a couple companies out there that have won some like major contracts, I think, notably in Texas, to set up charging stations. And so if you're thinking about like an investment opportunity or business idea, like this isn't like super complicated technology.
No.
Like it's been around, right? And the harder technology is on the car side, which is designing these vehicles that can, with these batteries and everything. But there are just not as many electric vehicle chargers as there are electric vehicles, right? So from a practical standpoint of someone who owns a Tesla, a topic of which obviously I now talk about endlessly because I am a Tesla owner. If you go, it's interesting to actually go to these Tesla charging stations, right?
Yeah.
Because you go there, right? And there are these, and Tesla Tesla knew that the major hurdle was always going to be the charging network, which they are continuing to invest in heavily, right?
Yeah.
But even in rural Alabama, where I'm currently residing, I can find superchargers, right, to get around the state if I need to, right? Because they have invested along areas where where people travel, like say you want to go to the beach or something. But if you go to these chargers, right, these chargers are only set up for Teslas. Like they're not set up for any other car.
That's what I was about to ask.
Yeah, and you go there and it's always kind of like a certain kind of person, right? You can definitely see the demographic who buys Teslas.
Yeah.
But if you're trying to find like a charger just kind of like out in the wild for like your Chevy Bolt, that could be a lot harder. And like the thing is, like most electric vehicles are powered at home. That's a pretty easy thing to do.
Right.
But trying to get from like one place to another, right, like is a lot harder. And that really is what Tesla got right. And it could be like, hey, there's too few charging stations. There's too much demand. The ones that are available, there can be broken chargers, confusing payment systems, uncertainty over how long cars need to charge. Like I remember I went to Disney World a couple weeks ago, and there's some superchargers around Disney World, but like if you want but Disney doesn't have like chargers, right? They have like these like there's like a few like they're like charge point, right? And they're you got to like pay for them and everything, and there's just like they're nowhere near as many as you would need. So if you're not a Tesla owner, right, and say you drove down another electric vehicle, you're kind of like shit out of luck, right? You're like, where are you going to charge your car? But what's interesting is I want to make sure I get this right, because it talks about Tesla adopted a fast So during the development and rollout of Tesla's car and charger platform, the company offered to allow other companies to use the patents on its charging standards and equipment, but none took up the offer. While Tesla offered open source charging technology, using it meant signing off on terms the world's biggest automakers were unwilling to accept. So basically Tesla was saying, much like the iPhone, right? Like, hey, you can use our standard and tech, right? You just have to like, agree to some terms. And they said no, right? So now there's like a competing standard, right? So like now you're at like this nightmarish level of like, hey, I have an Android charger for my, that won't plug into my Tesla, essentially, right?
Right.
But the same isn't true for Tesla, by the way, which is really smart of them. With an adapter, which they all come with, you can charge at nearly all fast charging stations.
Oh, that's awesome.
Yeah. So Tesla was thinking about this very smart. One reason why, like first mover advantage and everything.
Right.
But it's going to be difficult. I've seen more chargers out there. I've seen, like in Georgia and everything, I've seen more chargers being installed everywhere. But this is a big business opportunity. And like, say if you're a vet, right, like at an MBA program, say you want to do some sort of entrepreneurship through acquisition, right? Maybe this is the opportunity for you. Maybe you can find something. You can like, hey, it can't be that hard to install chargers everywhere. You just got to get there. You got to get the contracts. And all these car companies are, the Super Bowl right there, and like you're not seeing all these electric vehicles from these standard car companies. Like now might be the time. So
between like, I mean, all the car companies, all like the traditional, Ford, GM, Jeep, everyone who's kind of trying to reposition into electric vehicles. And in addition, with the new administration, who's very big on electric vehicle technology, I think you're totally right. This could be the time for some smart people out there to find the right contracts and turn this into a big business.
Yeah, this is the inflection point. This is going to be the hard stuff, but in like 10 years, it'll be interesting to see in 10 years from now.
Yeah.
All
right, everyone. That wraps up the show for the week. Before we officially sign off, Kyle, you got any last words?
I did a GMAT video with an AMA guest, Strobes, who runs the Instagram account Fighter Jet Cockpit.
Nice.
And so we are going to post it. It's going to be posted on my website and on YouTube. I think it's really interesting because we dive into the GMAT from like what it is, what it isn't, what matters, what doesn't matter, how business schools view it, etc. And I think it's going to be really cool and fun, and it's very relaxed way of approaching it. So please come listen.
Very cool. Very cool. Everyone. So just a couple quick announcements for the show. So this past week we hit 5,000 downloads, of which I'm pretty proud. A huge kind of turning point, was when Kyle and I partnered together to start the weekly SITREP. So I really enjoy everyone who's been coming out. And so plug with that. If you're listening to the show, please leave us a review, and then, leave a comment on there. It does a couple of things. One, it gives us feedback on what's going on with the show, and it also helps other vets find out about it. So we appreciate everyone coming in to listen, and we'll catch up with all you next week. All right.
Yep. Sounds good.
Take care, y'all.